LinkedIn presents.
It's a fact. We humans need hope. And here's the good news. Hope is a skill that we can learn. I'm Aarons-Mele, and this is The Anxious Achiever, the show that looks at the intersection of mental health and work, and how we can all do both better.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by TIAA. TIAA makes you a retirement promise, a promise of a guaranteed retirement paycheck for life. Learn more at TIAA.org/promisespayoff.
You know, when I've been in my darkest moments, really struggling with depression or an episode, it's been hope that I notice is the first thing to go. The combination of hope and joy. I need hope to keep going, because life can feel hard. We all do. When you're looking out on the future, this week, this month, this year, the rest of your life, it's the things that you look forward to that pop out, what keeps us motivated. That's why I was so intrigued when I stumbled upon the work of today's guest, because she's a hope expert. She's deeply studied the science of hope and developed a method to learn how to cultivate and develop and use hope, even when things feel really hard. Kathryn Goetzke is the founder and chairman at the Shine Hope Company, where she works with organizations and individuals to change their approach to situations. She also frequently shares her own experiences with depression, anxiety, ADHD, PTSD, and addictions. A small warning for the audience, this episode does include a mention of suicide and self-harm as we talk about hope and hopelessness. Now, my conversation with Kathryn, and she'll share how she changed her perspective on the world and embraced hope as a practice for daily life. So, Kathryn, I want to start with a very fundamental question. Why is hope so powerful for humans? Why do we need hope?
Well, because we need to be kind of moving towards something in our future. We call it kind of future orientation. But if we don't feel hope, to me, we're experiencing hopelessness, complete despair, and a complete sense of helplessness. And when we get to that, that's when we're violent. That's when we die by suicide. That's when we turn to addiction, And so hope is really key to kind of moving us forward in life and fulfilling our mission here on this planet and our purpose and engaging in humanity. So it is key really to life.
You mentioned, of course, the opposite of hope is hopelessness, but you also said helplessness. What's the connection there?
Yeah, so when I looked at hopelessness, across the literature, hopelessness was the single consistent predictor of suicide. And that's really what I wanted to solve for in figuring out how to hope. Because from a personal standpoint, I'm at a high risk of suicide. So I wanted to know how to keep myself alive fundamentally. And I knew that what they were teaching was 800 numbers or restricting access to means wasn't necessarily going to save me. And so when you look at hopelessness, it is both emotional, which is that despair. And so when I look at despair, sadness, anger, fear, and it's motivational helplessness. So those are the two components of hopelessness when you really break it down. And that helplessness is so important because if you feel powerless to do anything about it, that's when you choose to end your life. That's when you turn to addiction. That's when you turn to self-harm. If you're just in despair, but you feel like you have power to kind of navigate it and manage it, you can get through it. But when you feel both despair and helpless to do anything, that's when it gets really dangerous.
That's really interesting. So it's a two-part equation.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of research on deaths of despair. And I would call it deaths of hopelessness because your despair alone isn't going to make you want to end your life. It's that feeling of despair and that, I cannot do anything about this. And the thing about hopelessness is we all experience moments of hopelessness all the time. It's not like something's wrong with you. It's normal to feel moments of hopelessness. What's not normal is to not know how to manage it. And then when it becomes persistent, and then when it becomes a clinical diagnosis like anxiety or depression.
What is the science of hope? Why do scientists think that we developed hope as a species? I mean, I guess it seems kind of obvious. I don't know, like what's happening in our brains when we hope?
Yeah. I mean, even the feeling, the energy of that. I mean, it's a positive feeling. Like you've got to use negative feelings to get to it. Dan Tomasula is one of my favorite hope scientists. He wrote Learn Hopefulness, and he says it's like one of the only emotions or kind of states that you have to use negative emotions to get to the positive emotions. So I find that really interesting. So if you learn from your sadness and use that to fuel you to move forward to what you want in life, it can be really powerful. But the science of hope, they were measuring hope when I started this work over 10 years ago, but they weren't teaching you necessarily how to be hopeful. They knew the outcomes as it relates to hope. So there's a hope scale. It's 8 questions. There are several scales, but I really like Snyder's hope scale. 8 questions. There's a children's scale, 6 questions. And we know that we can measure people's hope. And as we increase their hope, their likelihood of anxiety and depression decrease. And we're able to prove that out. So I said, well, why aren't they teaching you this? And how could we potentially teach this? So I came at it, hope scientists don't necessarily come from the perspective of hopelessness. And that's what kind of differentiates me because I've been engaged in global mental health for so long. And I wanted to solve for hopelessness. So I wanted both that emotional despair, which is really mental health related work, and then the motivational helplessness. And hope scientists really focus on that helplessness. How do we get from helplessness to actions? How do we set goals for what we want in life? And how do we actually get to those goals and overcome obstacles and re-goal when necessary? If you want things in life, you've got to be able to set a goal. You've got to know how to set a goal, like evidence-based approaches for goal setting. And so that's part of what teaching hope is all about.
But when you're blocked by those emotions of depression, especially,
Yeah,
it's very, very almost impossible to set goals and to get that agency.
totally.
It's like a gate that's keeping you from accessing that.
Absolutely. The first thing I teach is you've got to learn how to identify and manage your stress response. So your fear, your sadness, and anger. You've got to learn how to manage those emotions in healthy ways. Understand them, stop running from them. I mean, I spent so much time running from my emotions and it just created chaos in my life that if I'd learned to embrace them and like really learn from them and listen to them and give them time and space, then I would have been much healthier and I could have alleviated a lot of my own kind of personal suffering. So yeah, I think that's so important. And that's why I brought the mental health work into that. I mean, I think it's so important that we learn those skills, like that despair work, how to really manage it before we just get to goal setting. And, I can set a lot of goals from an unhealthy, unhappy place, and it usually has me at the bar or, I was bulimic for a while. So I'd be on a food binge or, and those aren't healthy goals to set, but it came from despair.
I want to get into your personal story and why you do this work. I do want to say one thing, though, which is that it's my belief, and then I'm thinking also about recent scholarship uncertainty, though, that anxiety can actually motivate re-goaling if it's acknowledged
Yes.
in a healthy way, because anxiety is a threat response. And I would imagine that a really powerful state for a human is to feel a threat and then say, okay, this feels awful. I'm scared. I'm anxious, but what am I going to actually do about it? And then maybe hope comes in.
Totally. And I think there's so much fuel behind that. I think anxiety comes from fear. It's a fear. We're afraid of things. And if we can just learn how to be curious about that fear as opposed to thinking something's wrong with me, because once we start that negative thought pattern, it can really take that fear out of control, which it did for me in many ways. And so learning how to navigate that fear in healthy ways is so important. And you're right. There's what's called the allostatic stress load. So we do need a certain amount of stress to motivate us to, get us pursuing things, to have the energy. It's when it becomes persistent and overwhelming and way too much stress that it turns to burnout and we give up or we don't do anything. So it absolutely is important. And we teach kids that, like, if you're super afraid of something, dive into that because that's something that you actually care a lot about. And like, maybe that's why you're here and you should be working. A lot of people think global warming. And I'm like, use that as knowledge for what you care deeply for, and then use that energy in healthier ways and use it to create change and to innovate. Like, my most innovative times are when I dive into my despair about something, it like creates
Totally.
solutions. So,
I mean, how many movies have we seen where the arc of the hero's journey is that they face the dark night? Not the dark night as in Batman, the dark night of the soul. They are in despair. They are giving up. They feel completely hopeless. I have so many images in my mind of famous movies about journalists who are trying to chase the story, and it's 3 a.m. and they're in the office surrounded by papers and they're just slumped down, they're drinking. But then what happens, right? That is that spark of hope
yeah.
that then motivates them to complete the hero's journey.
Yes, exactly. I feel like it's when we surrender to it, we stop pushing it away or running from it or chasing things. It's, Michael Singer wrote a book, The Surrender Experiment, which I love from a business perspective because he built a massive business in the middle of nowhere, Florida, from allowing things to happen and just kind of flowing with it as opposed to really pursuing. And we're taught, from a business standpoint at a young age, we've got to pursue, go after.
Right.
And like, things happen for me when I step back and relax and allow, take inspired actions. Like, I have to act. That's part of it. And yet there's like a balance, if you're pushing too hard or too much, it drives things away in my experience.
You teach hope. You have a science-based approach. You call it SHINE. What does SHINE mean?
Yes. SHINE stands for stress skills. So how we identify and manage our stress response. I believe that's the first key to hope. And we can basically destroy our life in a second if we don't know how to do that. That's why people end up in jail, addicts, self-harming, if we're not managing our emotions in healthier ways. So stress skills, happiness habits are cultivating those long-term healthier habits that produce those positive hormones, oxytocin, serotonin. We've got to intentionally get those. And when we go through times of challenge, we often stop doing the things, out of guilt or shame or whatever that are healthy for us. And yet we need to, like, I kind of feel like it's always a battle between my stress hormones and my happiness. The more stress I have, the more I have.
Well, right. And sometimes, sometimes it feels better to let the stress win.
I know. It does. Yeah. And, we can get hits of dopamine from things like violence and self-harm. And so we've got to understand this. And so we might be choosing these things, but are they healthy for us? And how can we replace those with healthier things? I mean, that's what I was really doing in my I was searching for dopamine, getting out of my despair, getting those feel good. I wasn't doing things like exercising or eating well or making sure I got great sleep or the things that are healthier, ways to get the dopamine. So really important to kind of know that. And then I is inspired actions. So kind of how we set goals, overcome obstacles to goals, re-goal, super important. We teach SMART goals. It kind of helps you weed out the false hopes, because if it's specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound, you can actually make progress, and we teach a process for this. And then also why stretch goals are important, positive. So that's and then nourishing networks. So why it's important to have strong networks, healthy networks, people that are, helping us become our best self, not people that are encouraging us to do those unhealthy things. So that's the N. We're up to 95% more likely to accomplish our goals if we write it down and then we check in with someone regularly on it. So, it's really important to have those. That's why in workplaces, setting goals, making sure you have regular meetings with your bosses, getting support in the process, like, it's really important, and why I think hope is so important to workplace outcomes, and the evidence around it is pretty clear on that too. The E then is the eliminating challenges, which are negative thought patterns that get in the way of our ability to hope. So, when we ruminate, when we worry, when we internalize failure and our negative bias and trying to control things outside of our control, attaching to outcomes, these are all things that are, the ants, the automatic negative thoughts. But unless we teach kids about these and really all about these and how these can either help us or hurt us, we can't expect people to be healthy and live long, fulfilling lives because it's pretty easy to fall into those patterns. Our brain is kind of wired for that. And so to me, the intentionality is around understanding all of this and feeling my state and then, being conscious of where I'm at and proactively doing things to improve my state and to keep myself in an elevated kind of place. And then, just constantly looking at my despair and helplessness and moving through it.
So let's hear about your own story, your battle with addiction, with an eating disorder, with anxiety, with depression, your dad, as why you've devoted your life to teaching people how to hope.
I got pretty active in the global mental health space. 20 years ago, I started a company called The Mood Factory, creating a light bulb line based on how colors affect your moods. And I was looking to support a nonprofit in the mental health space at that time. And I found the branding around it to be so depressing. And I got engaged because I grew up with, my dad was a retail banker. And he knew Sam Walton well, and he loved Walmart, and he taught me all about retail and new products, and we'd go into every store and we'd make the trucks honk at us when we drive by and just, the distribution process and the product launching and all of these things. So I was obsessed with products and business from a very young age. I was like always innovating around my lemonade stands and always working. I just loved it. And so I knew I wanted to at some point have a product with a purpose because I was always bothered. Like I was also a very save the animals, save the planet, save everything, and my family, the rest of my family was very business oriented. And so I'm like, you kind of have to have a balance really of both. But I struggled a lot growing up. So my dad, when I was a freshman in college, died by suicide. And he struggled a lot with his stress response and anger and not dealing with his sadness as a young kid. And I tried my whole life to really help him. And I also escaped a lot from the chaos that was happening around me growing up.
But it sounds like you loved him so much.
Oh my God.
Too. And he was a prominent business person.
Yeah. And he came to every event and we were the best of friends. And, I was always trying to figure out why this was happening with him and how I could help him. I'd see him go from 0 to 100 in a second and I'd see it come over his body and his face. And there was no accessing him at that point. And I spent my first 18 years of my life trying to figure out how to fix this, help him, save him. Meanwhile, wasn't really dealing with my own emotions or myself. And so I started, with addictions at a very young age as a way to cope and to kind of numb that experience. So and then when he died by suicide, I was so traumatized by the suicide that it was very hard for me to even access any of this trauma that happened before he passed. And so it took a lot of unraveling. And I basically went from kind of one addiction to fixing that to another addiction to fixing that, smoking pot, drinking, eating disorders. But I'd fix one thing and another thing would pop up, which to me is just you're not getting to the root cause of what's happening. When I started, I worked for a bunch of companies and stuff, and then starting my business, seeing that in the mental health space, the branding to be so depressing, and then working to get really engaged in the global community. So I started a nonprofit at that time, and I just researched everything I could to learn more about it, to learn about mental health and whatnot. And it was about 10 years ago. So I got success with the brand. I got a distribution. We went into Lowe's Home Improvement. We did the first nationwide cause marketing campaign, raised a bunch of money. It was really...
You did the first nationwide cause marketing campaign.
Did.
That's amazing.
It's really...
What was the aha moment as an entrepreneur that said, people want good stuff, but they also care about stuff.
Yes. Well, and it's interesting because companies were putting logos on, I mean, it's what it is. They put logos on front of packaging for like a month during a certain period of time. And I'm like, why aren't they putting that on all the time? So I think growing up, I like always intuitively knew I wanted to do that. But in looking at the space, I mean, social impact, it's basically social impact now, entrepreneurism. So, but I thought, why don't we put a logo on and do it all the time? Right. And so that's what we did. And it was very interesting because once some retailers found out that it was mental health related, they didn't want me talking about it. So
When was this? Orient us in time.
20 years ago. And if you Googled depression back then, it was like there were distorted faces and people in the corner. I mean, it was just like terrifying, you know? And so I kind of got around how we did it. We did a lot of co-branded marketing with like breast cancer. We did some stuff with Komen and the American Heart Association. So I colored light bulbs and we'd light porches a certain color during a certain month and raise awareness and then do comorbidity kind of informational brochures. So that was the initial approach. And I got super active in the global mental health space. So Vikram Patel, he's pretty world renowned in mental health. He's now at Harvard, and I joined his global mental health advisory board, and I learned about all the human rights abuses happening around the world. And so I got really active with the World Health Organization, had this MHGAP Global Forum every year. I started attending. I just would like learn everything I could. You know, I was in a presentation and they were talking about suicide prevention as restricting access to means. So if you're feeling suicidal, lock up your medications, your guns, your pesticides, all of kind of the means of how you might take your life. And then 800 numbers and the importance of 800 numbers, which are both really critical when you're in time of crisis. And yet I knew that wasn't going to save me. I was never going to do that. Like,
Were you feeling suicidal yourself?
I mean, I have suicidal ideations all the time, still to this day. Oh, yeah. But I know now that it's not that I want to die. It's that I'm experiencing hopelessness about something. And I need to manage my despair and my helplessness around it. Like, it's just a flag for me of like, pay attention to this and work on your emotions and get out of your helplessness into action. Like, do something about it. Don't just avoid it or let it kind of fester. Because when I was doing research, I'm like, what causes it? And doctors would say, you're at a super high risk of suicide. You have all the risk factors. And so I'm like, well, what causes it? Like, if you want to prevent something, you have to get to the root cause. And across every single study I read, it was hopelessness, hopelessness, hopelessness. And then it's your primary symptom of anxiety and depression. I'm like, why don't I know what it is and how to manage it in a healthier way, you know? And looking back, like to me, I was just experiencing hopelessness about stuff and I wasn't managing my emotions well at all. I was running from them.
Can I ask you a question though?
Yeah.
Just because not everyone who experiences despair or even profound anxiety and depression has suicidal ideation.
Right.
Is there a piece of you that has intrusive thoughts or more of an OCD? Because I don't want listeners to associate necessarily despair with suicidal ideation.
Yeah, definitely not. No.
Because it doesn't always happen. And I'm curious, like, what the connection was for you there, like why it's so easy or why you access those thoughts.
Well, and it's hard to really know. I mean, so there's a gene, they found a gene that's associated to suicide separate from depression, which I find fascinating. There's a learned response. So my dad's sister died by suicide. My dad would talk about suicide when I was growing up. So like maybe I was conditioned, maybe I have a conditioned response to it. Society, and then being trained on what suicidal ideations even are, that I want to die. Like to me, we're training people incorrectly. That's not, do you know of Kevin Hines and his work? He is a, speaker now. The first thing I thought when I jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge is, I wish I didn't do that. Like,
right.
You make that decision and yeah, I had a suicide attempt in my 20s and I absolutely I was in such a state of despair and I had no idea how to manage it or what was even happening and didn't understand that when we're in that stress response, we can't make any intelligent decisions. And so our number one priority is to manage our stress response in healthy ways, not unhealthy ways, is to really get that stress response under control. So everyone experiences moments of hopelessness. You get an email from a boss. You might be angry or sad and feel helpless to do anything about it. It's just normal. You get cut off in traffic. You go to the store and they're out of something you want. Or, you get a
Right.
poor grade or even a A-, that's a moment of hopelessness. So,
and also for my audience, sorry, just to jump
Yeah.
in, for my audience, a lot of us are neurodivergent and we come up against struggles. We feel like I'm never going to get ahead. I'm never going to get promoted. I'm going to keep getting fired. I just can't make it in this environment because of my ADHD or my this or my that.
Yeah.
That creates a tremendous amount of hopelessness as well, and sometimes despair.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just call those limiting beliefs. And we've got to replace those with affirming beliefs and think about what we're saying to ourselves on a regular basis.
That sounds so simple.
I know.
It's really? I don't know.
It's intention. I know, but it's true. There's a lot of science around the fact that those work. So if you have specific things that you're constantly saying to yourself, Dr. Amen calls them automatic negative thoughts.
Yep.
They just kind of are so invasive. And that's our E. We have an E in Shine that's eliminating challenges, which are all of those negative thoughts we have. And affirming beliefs, there's great science that they actually can help transition what we think about. And, I've been diagnosed with everything under the sun, and I had to replace all of those with affirming beliefs about, you could say I'm OCD, but my attention to detail makes me, or my ability to focus, hyper focus, and continue to persist. I never would have been able to do what I've done.
No, it's what I call our hidden superpowers.
Yes, exactly. And we have to believe that. We have to really believe that and learn that, what society tells us isn't necessarily truth. And so we have got to be our own strongest, biggest advocate. Every person on this planet has value, has worth, is here for a reason, needs to feel loved, all of these things. Every child needs to feel that and be seen and has a purpose. And it's really about kind of navigating life to kind of figure out what that is and how to best engage with others. But there's a lot of people that say a lot of things negatively, and that just really, really makes our limiting beliefs even stronger. And so we've got to be intentional about, I've got to be so intentional about my hope.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by TIAA. In the last 100 years, we've seen financial markets swing, new currencies come and go, decades of savings lost in days, all showing that a retirement plan without a guarantee, quite simply, isn't enough. So more than a retirement plan, TIAA makes you a retirement promise. A promise of a guaranteed retirement paycheck for life. A promise that pays off. Learn more at TIAA.org/promisespayoff.
From the minds of visionaries to the desks of disruptors, I'm Lars Schmidt, host of the Redefining Work podcast. Join me each week as we explore the new world of work through the lens of those shaping it. CEOs, HR leaders, investors, and more. Be a part of the conversation that changes everything. Subscribe to Redefining Work today.
So let's talk about work. Let's talk about why the skill of hope is powerful at work.
You think about it, our work is all about accomplishing things, setting goals. And
right, it's very forward-looking, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Overcoming obstacles, re-goaling when we need to. Our employees need these skills. Hope, again, is a protective factor for anxiety and depression. And depression is really your number one workplace cost in terms of less productivity, engagements, and more so now. There was a recent study that 53% of parents were missing a day of work a month because of their child's mental health. And when you think about the cost of that in the workplace, so to me, it's really important that workplaces get engaged in all aspects of prevention and mental health work. For me, hope is an easier approach than this is a mental health course. This is a hope course, math and science and, and everyone needs to learn it and understand it. And it's not a violence prevention course. sexual assault course. It's a hope course, and yet it should address some of those. The higher in hope you are, the less likely you are to be violent or abusing people or engaging in risky behaviors or all of that. And so it's really a different way to approach it in a way that's holistic. We train entire workplaces on hope, and we can measure hope of the workplace and see.
How?
Yeah. So when I do talks, I do that real time. And people put in their hope scores, and we see up on the, how hopeful, and it's anonymous when we do that in presentations, and it's kind of amazing. And then, no matter what the results are, you kind of know how much work you have to do on your employees' hope. So it's a good kind of indicator of how many resources you need to be providing, what you need to be doing.
What are some everyday hope killers that you see a lot at work?
The news.
Okay, but at work specifically, like behaviors. But I guess the news is a terrible hope killer. I think we can all agree.
Yes. Okay. Not waiting 90 seconds. I have this timer.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you can see it. So it's a 90-second timer, but we have a 90-second physiological response to triggers. So when we're stressed by something, you get an email from your boss or someone says something unkind, you have this physiological response, and we're not trained that when those adrenaline and norepinephrine is like going through your body, you can't access your critical thinking and your problem solving, so you're reactive, and that's when you send those emails that just like escalate the whole issue. And so to me, not knowing about the 90-second stress response and taking those pauses, it can really hurt a workplace.
Oh. Especially when you have access to something like Slack, right? Or you live in work in a culture where your quick responses are expected.
I know.
It works against that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So should everyone have a 90-second timer?
Yes, put a timer on your watch. It's so long. Like if you just test it with someone in your family and just like go, I have to wait 90 seconds before, it's like, it feels like 10 hours. I mean, when we're triggered, it's so easy to be reactive, and can be such a compulsion. So yeah. Internalizing failure is if you get feedback and you think I'm a failure, and then you kind of internalize that and you stop working, and that's a hope killer in the workplace. In our nourishing networks, we have the 5-to-1 rule. So you have to say 5 positives to every kind of criticism you make about someone. And for me, it's a big challenge to have a productive relationship. And when you're working really fast and you're just kind of always in problem solving mode, which I'm just like always curious and trying to fix things and improve them, and it can come across as like the negative as opposed to taking a lot of time to recognizing the positives and the steps and the great things that are being done and all of that. So, I have to be really intentional about that. And that's not one of my strengths.
Well, being 5-to-1 with yourself is also nice too, right? For every nasty comment you make to yourself, it would be nice.
Oh my gosh. Can you imagine if we actually did? I mean, what a different world we would live in.
Yes.
Yeah. Such a good point. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those are really some key ones, not setting realistic goals. So setting goals that are unattainable, I'm trying to get this International Day of Hope passed at the UN. And we wrote this paper on how hope relates to each of the SDGs. And when you think about goals,
Sustainable Development Goals.
Yes. And so when you think about hope, it's like, of course, hope relates to all of the outcomes and all of those goals. And when you consistently pursue unattainable goals, you can develop clinical anxiety and depression. Of course you can. You're in constant despair and helplessness. And that's what anxiety and depression really are. And so that's another thing. I mean, if you're setting unrealistic goals and continuing to push that on your employees, and they continue to try to, meet the goals and they can't.
This is so important. And I want to lift this up also for listeners, because I've worked with clients. I had one client that went through constant reorgs. And so they'd have goals and it would be all signed off and everyone would get locked in, and then they would change 3 months later. And then they'd be like, okay. And then they would change again 5 months later. And that, I think also, when goals are constantly shifting and not trustworthy,
Yeah.
also kills hope because you think, well, it's
Yeah.
just going to happen again. Why should I even bother?
Right. Even try to move towards it. Yeah, absolutely. And our hope really predicts our ability to navigate through that change and like adversity. And even when you looked at COVID, like the higher in hope you were, the better you did during COVID. So to me, that's absolutely true. And the nature of our world right now, like if you don't embrace the fact that it's changing constantly and things are coming out of nowhere and we have to be innovative and we have to be able to kind of navigate that in healthy ways. Like to me, when the goals change, that's when you amp up your stress skills and cultivate happiness habits. And that's when the workplace provides space and time to do that and talks about it, talks about the stress of having to change again, and talks about how we're going to navigate the stress of that, you know?
Let's do a little like role play here. Say that I am a manager and it's come down from the top that we have to double our production, even though we've lost a bunch of people. And, obviously that's a moment where I'm feeling stressed and I know my team is going to go into those responses. What are stress skills that I need to work on in that moment?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think acknowledging the stress of it and giving time and space for everyone to talk about it
Yeah.
as opposed to not. Because when you don't give time and space to do that, people talk about it with each other and it just becomes this negative thing. Whereas if you address it and you talk about it and you talk about strategies for how you can all manage the stress of it together and try to work on regoaling and trying to think of how you can make these new goals attainable as a group with reduced resources and how you can kind of innovate around it. It's just really important to have the conversation. And when leadership just throws this stuff on people but doesn't give the time and space to address it, that's really harmful. I mean, we talk about our stress skills every week. I mean, we have so much stress, it's just the nature of life. How are we managing it in healthy ways? And how can we learn from each other about new ways to manage our stress and innovative things to do and like share videos or
Yeah. Yeah.
but creating a culture where it's okay to talk about it and it's okay to accept it. Like you don't want to run from the emotions. You want to acknowledge them. And hey, if you're having a challenge dealing with this and you need help, here are the resources within our company to do that. Here's the therapist or a coach. But again, goals have to be attainable. So if they're not, I mean, that, again, we know can lead to clinical anxiety and depression. And that's when you have to kind of make a decision for yourself about what you're going to do. So, and I think, it's important for companies to have stretch goals and SMART goals. So, like, if you don't have stretch goals, you're not going to reach for the start, So, a stretch goal is like, can you imagine if this would happen? Like, oh my gosh, like
Right.
Elon Musk has lots of stretch goals, right? And that's
What are Elon's stress skills? Tell me.
I'm not sure if they're the healthiest. I don't know that his Shine Hope story is, I would love to help him write his Shine Hope story.
Yeah.
Again, having those stretch goals and then having the SMART goals and knowing that we've got to be feeling accomplished and like we're meeting some of our goals and understanding that, some of them we may not, but we might really innovate around how to attain them if we open our mind in that way.
Right. Because the other thing about hope is that I always think of joy as a sister emotion to hope.
Mm-hmm. Or optimism. A lot of people.
Well, actually, that's a question.
Yeah.
How is optimism different than hope? Is it?
I mean, that's like emotional state. So to me, that's like a positive feeling. Like joy is that positive feeling. Optimism is the belief in a positive future. Hope is about belief in a positive future. And I have self-efficacy. I have skills and tools to actually get there. I can take steps in that direction, and that's so important for hope. And there's a famous book, Hope is Not a Strategy. It's a business book. And it's like, it's made this work harder, but it wasn't based on what we know around hope science. It wasn't the measurable, teachable. It was about hope as a wish for something. And if you think of hope as a wish, that's not action oriented. That's not teaching you the skills for how to actually attain what you hope for. And so that is what the work around hope science is all about. It's teaching how to feel good. So how to get out of that despair into positive feelings, which include joy and really optimism, but also getting from helplessness to inspired action. So
I see the difference as hope acknowledges the hardness. Optimism can be a little bit quixotic, right? It's
Yeah,
not always based in reality. Some people are born optimistic, I think, and that's their
totally.
natural set point. However, it doesn't mean that things are actually strategic and working out for them. But what I hear you saying about hope is acknowledging the hard part and saying, it's okay, we have a plan to get there and we can do
Yes.
this.
Yes, exactly. And that to me is the intentionality too, where that comes
Mm.
into it. Like it was easy for me to just default to despair and like helplessness about it. And I would argue for why I deserve to be sad or I've got this trauma or these things have happened. But like I have power over managing that sadness or that anger or that fear in healthy ways and doing things that I know will elevate those happiness hormones. So it's about taking that back and like understanding I have that despair and I have power over how I feel now, And the more I let the past control me or my, present moment, the worse it feels really too. So, and the further it takes me from why I'm here and what I'm supposed to be doing.
I'm curious if you have a story of an organization, a team, a person, a leader who you helped become hopeful.
I think kids teach me more about hope than leaders do.
Mm.
But I'm working right now with a company called School Health, and they are in Chicago and they work with school nurses and school health departments. And their CEO and their chief people officer have embraced hope, and they're writing their hope story.
What's a hope story?
The Shine Hope story. So we teach a framework for how you actually write your Shine Hope story and teach other people how to overcome a challenge. We like to talk about our problems, like in the go on and on about it, but we teach in our Shine Hope story, you write 20% what was the challenge you faced, and 80% what stress skills did you use, what happiness habits, what inspired actions. And we use that story format as a way to teach everyone how to hope. And to me, leaders can be, well, I don't want to write that story. They think of that means something happened to me or something's wrong with me. And I think it takes bold, courageous leaders to share just how they navigate life in healthy ways and how to write those stories. And so hope is so important. And we all do have hope stories and we've all got to talk about them and we've got to normalize that conversation. And to me, it's brave leadership. So they've measured hope of their entire company. They have an average hope score, and they're intentionally working to provide resources and tools to elevate hope and ensure that all of their employees have resources. So they don't wait until the time of crisis to address issues, but they're proactive and preventative in nature. So to me, that's super inspiring. And it takes courageous leaders to do that. And so many aren't, and so many just address things at time of crisis.
That's it for this episode of The Anxious Achiever. The show is produced and edited by Mary Dew with production support and sound engineering by Nick Krinko. If you like what you heard, head to your favorite podcast app. Leave us a review. It really matters, and we appreciate the time and effort it takes. And if you don't subscribe or follow the show already, now's the time. And let us know what you'd like to hear more of. I get some of my best ideas from my listeners, so find me on LinkedIn, send me a message. You can find my weekly newsletter there as well. A big thanks to LinkedIn and all the listeners out there and our guests in the Anxious Achiever world. Until next time.